This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to another episode of the Human Action Podcast, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy. A special guest this week, our friend Clifton Duncan, fresh off of his appearance, I think, with Dr. Drew recently. So how are you, gentlemen?
I'm doing good, Jeff. Clifton, glad to have you with us.
Good to be here, Bob. Yes, my foray into Dr. Drewdom was, I feel cleansed, I feel healed. Lots of good things happened. So,
what did you talk about?
Well, we basically talked about the how the mandates and COVIDianism have impacted my career specifically, but society at large. I was very surprised at how on my side he really was. I sense a real palpable anger in him as far as how the medical establishment has conducted itself, and so it's really heartening to see somebody with his reach having these kinds of conversations. So just it's good to get out there and kind of run my mouth a little bit, speak my piece.
Now, I think we were talking offline about how he found your video at the Mises Institute a month or so back.
Yeah, that it's so weird how that worked out. I've gotten a huge response as a result of those remarks, and people keep asking me, "Can you feel how much of an impact you had?" And I said, "No, not really. I just I said what I had to say, and I sort of went back to normal. I think part of it is just after years of being in show business, you learn not to get to your, you do kind of cool stuff, and then you kind of disappear onto the subway afterward, and kind of go back to life as it was until you go on to the next show. So for me, I'm genuinely shocked and surprised at how positively people have responded to it. So, but yeah, Dr. Drew said he saw that, and he said he watched like 2 minutes of it, and he said he really had to. He really had a strong desire to get me on as a guest. So it was pretty cool.
Well, what's a little disconcerting is if you look at some of the response to that video, just speaking plainly or honestly or truthfully is now viewed as this dazzling act of enlightenment or something. If you read the comments like, oh my gosh, he said it like it is or something. Well, I thought we were supposed to say it like it is.
Yeah, well, people, it's weird for me because people keep saying, oh, you're so courageous. Oh, you're brave for standing up and speaking out. And while I do acknowledge and appreciate, I don't want to diminish, because there are also those people who say, you've kept me sane, and I feel like I'm not alone because of the things that you've been saying and doing. But for me, I don't necessarily feel like it's that courageous, because I think there's a lot of people who actually agree with me. They're just afraid for whatever reason to say anything about it. So I feel like I'm in good company, and that company grows every day. So it's sort of similar to what you were saying. Is I don't take it as any sort of massive deal. I think that's part of why I'm so surprised by how people have responded to it.
Well, I think just you guys are both right that it's, on the one hand, Clifton, you're probably wondering like why are people reacting? So I'm just telling my story. This is what happened, and this is not particularly correct, but because especially people who have like regular quote 9-to-5 jobs and whatever, I think they just haven't felt like they could say anything the last few years, and not just on the COVID stuff, but like should boys be able to say I'm a girl and play in sports? I mean, a lot of people, like there's things that are to a lot of people are just common sense, but they feel like I'm not allowed to say that, or I'm going to get called in the HR department. So when they see someone saying, what is obvious and in any other era wouldn't be particularly courageous, like that's why, and then people need to do that if everyone else is afraid to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, part of the problem is there's not enough people, it's always someone else. People always say someone should do something. Someone should do something. And at a certain point, you kind of look to your left and look to your right, and you realize that not a lot of people are really doing something that should be done. So you kind of have to be that person sometimes.
Well,
oftentimes.
Joe Biden is doing something. He's getting rid of 10 grand of everybody's student loans. So,
nice segue.
Who knew? Who knew Joe Biden was such an activist? But here's the thing. I want to talk about this a little bit from a political angle. I mean, obviously, we can get into the economics of what this means, but I remember not that long ago when the press breathlessly announced that they were at $1 trillion worth of outstanding educational debt out there in the United States. Now it's 1.75 trillion, just about 5 years later. So that's a pretty big enchilada to start with. 2/3 of that debt, by the way, is held by females. So I think that's interesting because from my perspective, although this is being attacked, conservatives are pointing out the moral hazards, the economic, they're using these dopey phrases like, well, this will cost the government X because these are federal student loans, and this is what it'll do to the budget. And there's an estimate from Wharton School of Business that this is maybe $300 billion to $900 billion in cost to Uncle Sam over a period of years. But here's the thing, guys, I actually think this was smart politically because the furor over this will dissipate in a week or so, like everything else in media-driven clown world America. And what we'll be left with is that the general public across time, taxpayers, consumers, will feel the pain from this, but that'll be very amorphous and very diffused, whereas the actual young people mostly, who immediately have their loans paid off or at least have them reduced by $10,000, that's very tangible, very concrete, very real to them. And I think along with the Dobbs decision, which at least presumably will motivate a lot of younger females to go vote Democrat in the upcoming midterms. Maybe there's another constituency here of student loan borrowers, again, heavily female, who are going to go vote for the Biden ticket or the Democratic ticket, at least in the midterms. So I don't know. I mean, as bad as this is from my perspective, when you let people off the hook, I don't think you're doing them any favors either. But, nonetheless, I think this is maybe smarter politically than the Biden administration is getting credit for.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's politically, and maybe if we want to talk about economics in a minute, we can. But yeah, just in terms of the politics, because I've seen the way the arguments are going back and forth, and I follow a bunch of people on the left on Twitter just for that purpose, just to kind of want to see where they're coming from and how they're viewing it. And yeah, like they're, what's his name? Crowder and Ben Shapiro were coming out hard against it. And then people were going, and I don't know, I didn't realize this was public information, but you can see who took one of those Paycheck Protection Act loans that were forgiven and showing that, oh, well, you guys had no problem getting $70,000 loans forgiven. And again, and I'm not even saying that that's a fair comparison, but it's just things like that. And I saw people saying like they were mocking the attitude of, well, gee, I did the right thing. I was responsible and paid off my student loan debt. Where's my bailout? And so then they were taking that and saying, well, gee, I can afford food. Where are my food stamps? And in other words, like they are very good at like sort of making the Republicans look like they're really obtuse on this. And again, I'm not saying that the arguments, the criticisms are wrong, but I think, yeah, if people think, oh, Biden, this is a bridge too far, I think they're misreading it. That no, the people who like this are going to think this is common sense. Of course, we bailed out, the Republicans bailed out the bankers in 2008, so why can't we bail out the students?
There's also a question for me that brings this up. I mean, this is an issue that affects me personally. I'm one of those people that people, I think, justifiably make fun of for taking out exorbitant loans for a career that has very little return. But at the same time, it makes me think about I mean, I like you, Bob, I've been observing what people have been saying primarily on the left side of the spectrum. And but the question that keeps bubbling for me is, what we value, what is the true value of higher education now? And, if you really wanted to help students out now, maybe you would try lowering tuition at all these institutions. But at the same time, why are we not educating more young people about part of it is basic economics, I suppose. But, do you really need to go like there is this idea on the left that the only path to success and is going to college, getting education. And I mean, they're not wrong about the power of education, although what their idea of education is, I think, is certainly debatable. But it's also on a deeper level, like, what is the value of your future? How can we help young people understand the implications of the decisions that they make today and how it's going to impact them down the road? I think it's really interesting, Jeff, you brought up. I wondered if this would come up, this idea that women owning the lion's share of student loans and how that's going to have an impact on demographics, family, all kinds of things in the future.
Well, one problem is that you and Bob went to NYU. See, I
Tell me
got to
about
go
it.
to these fancy schools, man. I went to a big state public university. Come on. So that, I mean, obviously, we're never going to truly know the costs of this, again, because they're going to be spread out over time, over a lot of people. But it seems to me that, as Bob mentioned, the conservatives are a little tone deaf here, because let's say it's $1 trillion. Okay, well, we sneezed $1 trillion. Congress was passing $3 trillion bills over COVID. Well, certainly student loans are as big of an issue in society as COVID. I mean, we send tens of billions to Ukraine. The TARP bill in 2008, which gave money to big companies like AIG and Bank of America and Citigroup. I mean, that was something like $475 billion. Now, a lot of that ultimately got paid back, but nonetheless, GM, Chrysler got money. So you can understand that conservatives don't look great here when they cry uncle over $10,000, especially to a younger person. The other thing is that Republicans tend to do a bad job of using political might to reward their constituencies and punish their opponents, right? I mean, what do Republicans do? They pass capital gains tax cuts, and that disproportionately helps people who make $500,000 in Silicon Valley or make $2 million a year at Goldman Sachs, and almost all those people vote Democrat, by the way. Yeah, they enrich defense contractors by going to the Middle East for 25 years. And are defense contractors Republicans? Maybe. But it seems like Democrats, when they get the White House and the Senate and the House of Representatives, say, okay, what's our constituency? Well, it's higher ed and academia, and it's young people, especially young people with loans who are feeling despondent. So I don't know. In the scheme of things, in today's funny money, what's $1 trillion?
Yeah, and also too, in terms of like the tone deaf, and again, I'm not trying to just ride the fence and not take a sit, but it's I think there is an element here where like this hard line. Well, these kids they took out the money and they should have known better, and that's tough, and you got to. But it's sort of like if somebody joins the military right after 9/11, and then I feel bad, like they got sold. They really they, in my opinion, should not have done that. That was a foolish decision, but you can understand if they were young and they grew up in a culture that, rah, rah, USA. And so likewise, I mean, up until at least recently, like kids have been taught you need to go to college or else, you have no future. You're a loser.
Yeah.
You got to go to college, get that college degree. They get there. They didn't choose the curriculum. People make fun of them like, oh, go study basket weaving and whatever. But I mean, is that the 18-year-old's fault that's, what's on display there? And so, they get stuff, they don't learn any skills. Then they come out and they have this huge debt. And then it's not like there's a true free market for them to go into where they can, the government has all sorts of things. So, but in other words, the people who were defending the PayPal, the like Ben Shapiro types taking that because they were saying, well, the government shut down the economy. So that's why it was fine for business owners to get some of that money back. Well, likewise, even in normal times, there's a sense in which the government shuts down the economy. And so grads can't go earn as much as they could without government intervention. So I'm not saying I'm agreeing with Biden's plan, but to just come out and like all of a sudden be a tough guy and, well, these kids are idiots and they should know better and they better suffer and pay that. Like, I think at the very least, it does come off as tone deaf.
They're 18 years old. What do you want them to plot out their whole future at 18? Plus, we told them it was good debt. Right?
Right. This was responsible.
And it wasn't the end. Yeah, it's a really, I think it's such a complex issue because it's how do you deal with mistakes that people made when they were that age? I mean, I think of the stupid things that I did at the age of 23, which are impacting me now, but I didn't have the knowledge base. So again, it goes back to what are we teaching these kids about the future, and how severe have our lives been about the value of a higher education, or if it's really, really needed for the vast majority of people.
Well, if you went to an 18 or 20 or 22-year-old today and said, okay, you have no skills, no job, no credit history, and no collateral or assets, and you want to borrow 50 to 100 grand from Bank X, Bank X would say no. It declined, no thank you, right? But yet we do this without even a credit check for young borrowers. And look, they're adults. They're over 18. There's not necessarily even a cosigner. So this is a pretty crazy system. And we can't call it the free market because, again, based on credit risk, that you would never get that loan. Even if you were going out to buy, let's say, plumbing equipment or a work truck or something that might actually produce income for you, not just frivolously going on vacations or buying a fancy car or something. Maybe you were buying tools and work assets. You still wouldn't get that money. It's only education loans follow this crazy path, and it's because they're guaranteed by the federal government if they're not actually issued by the federal government.
And then going along with that too is, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but I think you can't bankruptcy your way out of student loan debt. And so that's like another element of it too. And that's partly, so yes, I think obviously it's the federal backstop that, is the main driver of that. But also, yeah, there's a special thing where you cannot get rid of student loan debt, unlike other types of debt.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Let me just mention.
Wouldn't bankruptcy act as a drag on the schools? I think that would be a healthy moderating mechanism.
Well, right. I mean, that's kind of what was driving all this. Like, in other arenas, to say, well, why aren't people, taking out $100,000 loans to buy a bunch of equipment to go dig holes and fill them back up? You'd say, well, somewhere along the line, someone's losing money, and the banks, would have to write those loans down or whatever. But in this arena, that doesn't happen because, yeah, even though the kids are racking up huge bills for tuition that isn't really, justified in any sense, it just, the whole racket keeps going. Yeah, because ultimately the taxpayers are on the hook, and so there's nothing stopping that. So yes, if they had the bankruptcy in place, or just defaults in general, then that would ultimately stop it. Because you're right, a regular employer, like if there was somebody promising he was going to go to medical school or something and become a brain surgeon, then it might make sense, but that would be a much more tailored item, and they would probably have to sign something more particular about, when you go to your first hospital deployment, we get 30% of your wages or something.
Well, I mean, Clifton, let me ask you this. When you went through your master's program at NYU, do you think they did a good job in educating you, and did they do a good job in placement afterwards?
No. Well, bearing in mind that, I entered into an industry which is very, very unlike many other industries. In terms of placement, it depends on the kind of institution you go to. So if you go to an NYU or a Juilliard or a Yale, you're not going there because you want to teach at some musical theater school in Wyoming. You're going there because you want to be right in the thick of the industry. You want to put yourself at the end of 3 years. These programs typically last 3 years, in front of all the top agents and casting directors and producers, et cetera, in New York and LA. That's why you go to these schools. So in terms of placement, it is worth it in that sense. There are people who work for years and years and years just trying to get their foot in the door in these kinds of situations, to be seen by this many types of industry people. That said, and I still see this today. Going back to the first part of your question, they make the money extraordinarily easy to access, and in a program like mine, there was just. They would actually kick you out of the program if you tried to get a job because there's just no time. You couldn't dedicate yourself to doing that. So unless and I had a lot of help, stipends and other aid. Yet I still had to pay for living expenses in New York. And what they do was that, you have all these banks. They're nicely positioned at various places, peppered about the campus. And they have, tables set up with some nice, fresh-faced young people trying to sign you up, to get accounts or whatever. But it's filling out the FAFSA forms and trying to secure all this aid and everything. I mean, they just, unless you know what to look for, they don't really make it obvious or explicit what it is that you're doing and and the ways in which you're signing your life away. So in that sense, it's quite predatory. But then at the same time, it's like, well, is it society's fault that, that I was dumb about this kind of thing? I don't know if I can really make that assessment.
But prior to COVID and everything it did to, stage and screen and your industry, would you have argued differently? Would you have said NYU loans were worth it up until COVID?
It's really tough, Jeff, because even before I went, I had people who were saying, well, you could just work. And again, I think you are paying for the training, and I will say that the way that my trajectory went, I think it was valuable for me to go, but at the same time, it's like, well, you could spend that 3 years, busting your butt, catering and waiting tables and taking classes and auditioning and getting work elsewhere and learning that way. And, you maybe won't be saddled with that much debt. Who knows? Now, though, part of the issue is that so many of these institutions now, they're demanding that you take the COVID vaccine or boosters just for entry anyway. But given what the industry is now, I mean, yeah, if you want to be a part of that more traditional machine where you're doing plays and you're doing films and everything, it's still a great pathway to take to get in there if you're one of the few people who manage to get in that way. But it's a big gamble. I mean, the industry is a casino anyway. So you have to look at the odds where the top 1 or 2% of actors are those who are like the movie stars. And there's another 10, additional 10 or so who are working and comfortable and maybe upper middle class, and then a huge class of people who are they're jobbing. They call them journeymen or jobbing actors, where you're taking jobs where you can get them. You're doing commercials here, some voiceover here, a play or two here, and you're patching things together. It's just it's a big crapshoot.
That sounds like academia, Bob.
Oh yeah,
that's hilarious.
Yeah.
But I will say, I mean, there's a lot of arts institutions that do this kind of thing, and I think that is something that might need to be examined.
But apart from what you actually learned in your coursework or didn't learn, I mean, it's the credentialism, right? The world views you differently. Maybe you view yourself differently as a result of having that NYU credential.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a prestige attached to it, but it's a prestige within your niche. With regard to the more practical aspects of life, that's the big question. But it's again, it's a very impractical industry and vocation. So.
Yeah, well, to your point there, Jeff, I mean, in general, not just for a fine arts program, but yeah, I mean, the standard economic analysis of this stuff is to say it's largely a signal. That, in other words, if you go to a challenging undergrad and you major in physics and have a 3.9, someone is more likely to hire you, even if the job has nothing to do with physics, because they just know the kind of person that is willing to take that on and then get through such a program. They have commitment, blah blah blah. That it's just more of a signal. And then the issue now is our firms saying maybe there's more effective ways for us to vet people and have them demonstrate to us that they're the right kind of person, rather than going to these 4-year things where it's really a fuzzy signal or noisy signal.
So it's a conformity ritual in a sense, and it's a signal to employers that you can slog through something maybe boring or whatever it might be. But with grade inflation, a lot more employers have questions about degrees, even if you have a 3.9, even if you went to a fancy school. I mean, that's not what it used to be. Charles Murray wrote a big article, I want to say about 10 years ago. And he basically came out and said, look, probably about 25% of high school kids should go to college. In other words, what you used to learn in K through 12 about classics, history, humanities, writing, philosophy, math, science, even poetry and art and music, what you used to learn in K through 12, what we would call a broad liberal arts education with some math and science thrown in, you no longer get competently in K through 12 in most of the country. And so you have to learn it in college. So that's, obviously that's a problem. But barring that, Charles Murray says, well, maybe about 25% of high school students really show the aptitude towards intellectual work, what we used to consider undergraduate education to be. And of those 25%, maybe only a fraction of them, 5% of them or something, have the inclination or natural aptitude to go on to graduate or postdoctoral work. So we should have a tiny fraction of the universities and professors we have in the U.S. today. And I'm inclined to agree with that. I'm inclined to think that a lot of what we consider education, higher education, is really just glorified stuff that our grandparents would have learned in K through 12.
Yeah, I think that's entirely. When I was teaching, like at Hillsdale, even, and that was an above average, private school, And I was very comfortable saying half these kids shouldn't be in college. And it is, by the way, too, and it doesn't, I'm not saying because, and they're not as smart or as intelligent. It wasn't even that. It was just a lot, they were there because, their parents said they had to go, and they would just ask, is this going to be on the test? Because they know, I got to get an MBA because I'm going to run my family business or whatever. And like you were saying, Clifton, it's not enough to just say, are these 4 years or whatever it is, did you learn anything? But you have to compare it to what could they have done had they been working for that time, and so that's really what you got to compare it to. So it's the opportunity cost. So yeah, I think he's, that wouldn't surprise me, Jeff, if he's saying he thinks only 25%. Yeah, I would agree. And let me just mention too, because from the professor's perspective, if you can't even, it's not good for anybody. So it's not good for the kids that shouldn't be there. They're bored out of their mind, and it's hard for them. They just go 4 years thinking they're failures. But then for the top half, they can't get into stuff as much because the professor can't leave the other ones behind. And so it's nobody's happy that the overachievers are bored because this is easy stuff. I can't believe he keeps having to go over this. And the other ones, they're totally lost. So they're bored too. So it's really just, it's not a good system.
I wonder, is this going to accelerate maybe in a what's the word I'm looking for? Accelerate in a maybe in more underhanded way the collapse of the university system? Because I'm thinking back to your question, Jeff, about the world as it is now, and I think one of the more exciting things about now is that there's just so much you can learn online. Like, sure, if you're going to STEM, going to school for STEM or something, or studying or going to medical school, there's definitely a lot of reasons to go to these institutions, but now there's just so much stuff you can just find online yourself. So why even bother going in the first place? And I wonder if more people now, because of we're having conversations about loans and tuition, if more people really are thinking like, I don't know if it's really worth it. Maybe the whole myth of you have to go to college to make it, maybe it's finally dying a much needed death.
Well, I hope so. I certainly hope so. Bob, are you familiar with Brian Kaplan's book on this subject? I think he argues that parents drive a lot of this decision making, and that there's still a status element or whatever that keeps kids going, even when on some intellectual level we know that college isn't a good deal.
Right. So I literally read his book, but I have seen, when he was blogging about doing podcasts, so I'm very familiar with his arguments and the data he collected. And and there's a lot of little tells. So his big thing is that, the point of college right now is that signaling mechanism. And can't we as a society come up with more effective ways to signal to an employer that I'm the right type of person for you rather than this crazy ritual? And you're right, Jeff, that there's like prestige that, I was the first person in my family to go to college, that kind of thing. And so now if a kid says, I don't want to go, everyone just assumes, it's because you're lazy or you just don't have what it takes or whatever, as opposed to, maybe you're an entrepreneur. Right. So there is all that element. But like he has some cute little observations or things like to say, in any other arena, if you paid tens of thousands of dollars for something and then they canceled what they were going to give you, like if you paid for a cruise and then they said, instead of it being 7 days, it's only going to be 5 days, you'd be outraged. But when kids, ostensibly are paying all these money to go to college, and then the professor emails and says, hey, I'm sick, no class tomorrow, the students all cheer. So that shows, it's not that they actually value what they're getting. It's they're there because I want to get this diploma.
Well, one point he makes is that almost any Ivy League school, if you happen to live near one, the professors are happy to let you, as just some normie civilian, go sit in quietly in the back of class and audit the class. I mean, they won't be offended. They'll be flattered. So anybody can go do that, but nobody does.
Right. And there's a lot of, like even, MIT lectures on whatever, black holes and stuff. There's a lot of stuff, like you're saying, Clifton, you can get online and it's basically just as good. I mean, you don't have the one-on-one feedback and whatever if you're doing problem sets or something, but you're right. A lot of people don't do that. And that you're right, Jeff, that's one of Brian's main points, is to show the reason most people are going to college now is because they feel like they have to. And so, and part of unraveling that, to what Clifton was wondering, I think it's as more and more employers are willing to take a gamble on somebody who doesn't have a college degree, and they realize that at this point, not having a college degree doesn't mean perhaps what it meant in 1975 for men at least. Then that's partly. So if it's not any more career suicide to not go to college, then that's really what will unravel it.
I just wonder, I mean, are there really just a massive collective of employers out there who just, they absolutely must have somebody with a college degree? Because I've just, even in my own exploits, just dealing with, I call them civilians if they're not in the industry, but just just normal regular people. It's like, so many people are dumb. I feel like I would just be happy to find someone who's reasonably qualified and intelligent. Like, and it seems nowadays that if they actually went to university, they have a chance of turning out dumber than when they went in. So, is there really this massive team of employers who haven't got with the program yet? They haven't noticed anything. I find that hard to believe.
Well, the thing, so I get what you're saying, and I'm not sure exactly what the right answer, but in terms of what the studies, things show that, like, if you just run regressions on people's wages, if you have a college degree, you tend to be paid, there's a significant effect. And partly what Brian was showing is he was showing that if somebody, goes to 3 years of college, then they get paid more on average than someone who went to 0, but going to that 4th and getting the degree, that really just puts you up, what I mean? So it's not like each year of college boosts your pay by the same proportion, in other words. So it's, and so that's the to try to show it's not the what you're getting from the classes, it's that's a signal for some reason. And so you're right. It's, to answer your question, Cliff, it's not that the argument isn't that you can't get a job if you don't have a college degree, because obviously there's plenty of people without degrees who have jobs. It's just, in general, on average, do you tend to be paid more or have a higher position in the company if you're a college grad? And so far, like in the last 30 years, that tended to be true.
Right. I think that tended to be true, but it also matters a lot what major and what industry. Right. I mean, there's a lot of majors now where the cost benefit, especially if you're going to incur debt. I mean, my argument would be this: if we're living longer, and the United States, we're doing our best to reduce life expectancy in this country, which is pretty sad. But nonetheless, let's just say you're going to live to 90 if you're fortunate. And, you're not going to stop working at 65 anymore. You're probably going to work till 75 or something like that. So that sort of stretches out your 20s in a way. And so I would argue against rushing into any kind of debt at age 18 to 22 just to choose a major that's going to dictate the rest of your life, because I don't think an 18-year-old knows what the hell they want to do for the rest of their life. And, take your time, even if that means going to community college, stopping for a while and working, saving up some money, living at home, these kinds of things. I think if you want a degree or you need a degree, coming out at 28 or 30 without any debt strikes me as a better plan than rushing through and coming out at 22 or 23 with that. Because let's say you rush through, and then you say, well, I'm going to go to medical school. I'm going to be a doctor. And then you spend your whole 20s basically in school and residency. You probably come up with, if you're not wealthy or something, you probably come up with at least 100, maybe 200 grand worth of medical school debt. And then you're 30 and you start being a doctor, you don't like it. At that point in your life, you're pretty locked in. And so to me, what the real cost of student loan debt is that it boxes people in. And that's what's so criminal about this system of just saying, oh, yeah, just sign. Don't worry. You'll get a better job. You'll make more money because you have a degree. Don't worry. You'll be able to pay for it because you'll be a professional. Especially in a time where the distinction between blue collar and white collar has never been more blurred. For our grandparents, that was like, hey, white collar was, oh yeah, go to college, you'll be a doctor or a lawyer or something. Whereas today, I mean, you go out to a construction site, what's blue collar and what's white collar? I mean, the guy in the construction site might be in his Ford F-150, downloading something onto his laptop, for the job, plans or billing or something like that. So, I think rushing through, and I'm going to I have this experiment upcoming in my life because I got a 17-year-old, and I'm not going to push him into the maw of this college industrial complex. That's for sure.
What kind of conversations have you been having about that? And has he been receptive to them?
I'm not
So
sure
that's
that
an
my
answer right there.
words. I'm not sure that my words are being listened to very carefully at present. We'll see how that goes.
was gonna say, do you have to do the reverse thing to say, I really want you to go to college, and then you won't?
Well, I think it really is a new world, and you really can learn a lot of things online. You could, if you wanted to be a software guy, if you wanted to learn to code, I think you would be crazy to go to 4-year and pay for all that excess undergraduate stuff. But as far as the liberal arts end of things, I mean, a lot of things I read in school, I don't think I would have ever read on my own, either then or later on as an adult. I needed the pressure of worrying about my parents, worrying about grades, having a test, having credit hours, having that coursework. If I hadn't had that, would I have ever read Beowulf, I mean, or Canterbury Tales, or, would I have done calculus? No, I would never, ever, ever at any point in my life have done calculus without just the fact that it was required and my parents would kill me, right? Those were the two motivating factors. But looking back, I'm glad I went through calculus. So, I think sometimes it's easy for it to be dismissive and say, oh, you go into plumbing or go into construction or skilled trades or something like that. But I mean, the reality, that's not so simple and not so easy.
I was supposed to read Beowulf and I still didn't. So there's that too.
It's horrible.
Yeah,
no, it's not horrible.
I feel compelled to say the same thing, and I think Clifton, you were mentioning it too, that at NYU. So yeah, I didn't learn much economics at NYU, but I learned a bunch of math in the economics PhD program. But certainly, and I would not have worked as hard, like to your point, Jeff, if I hadn't been in there and be like, oh my gosh, I can't fail out. Like, I've been such a good student up till now. I can't, what am I going to tell my parents if I tell them I had to drop out? So, so there is that element. So it's certainly, yeah, I'm not saying it's nobody should go, but on the other hand, you see all these success stories, and maybe the right thing is for a lot of people to try it and see what it is, but then they drop out, and go start a company. There's plenty of examples like that.
I mean, Clifton, I'm curious. You have your higher end schools like Juilliard. You mentioned NYU, whether it's Pratt, schools like that. But what about all these art institutes that seem to be in every city? Are these pretty scammy at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, it depends on what they're trying to offer. I mean, if you go around New York, I mean, there's New School and NYU and other institutions around there. And I think the idea of going to college to major in some kind of art, anything, is just really not a good idea anymore. But it's like, well, what are they promising on the way out? It's one thing if I'm going to the Savannah College of Art and Design or something, and I'm learning how to draw. But what's stopping me from jumping online and learning how? I mean, there's a billion tutorials just online to learn how to draw. Why do that? So what are they offering? If you go into one of these acting programs, unless again you go into one of the big three, Yale, Juilliard, or NYU. I mean, that's you might do a showcase at the end of your degree, or the end of your program, but is it really going to help you to be seen by all the top casting directors in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, if you want to work in D.C., I guess. But I think I don't know if they're scams per se in terms of they're offering students the opportunity to explore and learn in whatever their chosen vocation or craft is. But again, from a practical perspective, especially now, and as we've been saying, you can learn so much online, with the exception of certain performance arts, unfortunately. I don't see the point. So it's not a scam intentionally, but it is a scam consequentially.
Well, do you think Biden is buying votes? I mean, what would your approach to this be? Would you get rid of student loans in a perfect world?
Oh, that's such a tough one. It actually made me think about, you mentioned earlier, that women hold a large proportion of this debt. And I remember years and years ago, I just happened to Google the top 10 majors broken down by gender. And so it's one thing if you're talking about forgiving a bunch of people who studied oil engineering and, in physics, or became brain surgeons. But then when you look at the top 10 majors for women, I mean, I think it was like business administration was number one for both men and women. But then when you move down the list, it's things like psychology and education and art history. And I think I a lot of what I've been observing from more working people, maybe more right-leaning circles, is this huge realm of this bunch of ire and resentment who are saying like, look, you went and majored in something stupid, which isn't lucrative. So why should I have to, my government, aka me, have to foot the bill for this? I really don't know. This is why I sing and dance, and I don't know what the great solution would be, because you're talking about mistakes that people made in the past. I mean, maybe forgiving some of it is okay, but then why stop there? I mean, I see the progressives right now. They're sort of upset because it's a step in the right direction from their perspective, but why not more? So why not 10,000? Why not 50,000? And then once they get to 50,000, why not more there? And then what will be the ripple effects of those policies? So I'm not sure. I don't know what the political solution to this would be, if we're talking about solutions as opposed to looking at the trade-offs as we should be wont to do. That was my weasel way of getting out answering that question.
Yeah, well, to me, Jeff, I think what should be uncontroversial, like from people who think like we do, is that the federal government should stop guaranteeing and or just directly advancing things. And by the way, on that point, like this is something I didn't realize until fairly recently. But when in Obama's first term, there was a bunch of legislation, part of which was in the Affordable Care Act, where the federal government has just a much bigger direct role in all these loans. So like, just to give you guys numbers, in 2008, the government itself held about $135 billion in student loans. In the most recent number, it's $1.5 trillion. So it's like 90% plus of the outstanding student loan debt is literally held by the government, not just, guaranteed by it. So I think, they stopped doing that for sure. And then on the issue of, should they forgive? Well, I mean, regular banks, if somebody can't make the payments, they default, and then, you quote, forgive it, you write it off. So it, not necessarily as an act of mercy, but, I think that's at the very least, that's how it would shake out. If somebody just can't pay that back, at least get rid of the, the rules against you can't bankruptcy out of it. In other words, don't have student loan debt be the sacrosanct thing that nobody can ever escape from. To me, that seems pretty standard, just to treat it like other forms of debt.
Well, we got to wrap this up, but I'll close by saying this. I mean, obviously we need market discipline applied to universities. We've got an oversupply. There's no question about it. And the student loan guarantees by the federal government are just obviously, from an economics perspective, insane. But here's the good news. If you do happen to be listening and you're going to get $10,000 taken off your federal student loans, you don't have to pay income tax on that. Normally, cancellation of debt income is taxable. But Congress, in one of the earlier bills passed during the stimulus period where student loan payments were suspended, actually got rid of that. So there's no income tax ramifications apparently to this. There's going to be probably some constitutional challenges, perhaps, but since it's the federal government issuing these loans, who has standing to sue? Probably nobody. So we're going to have to leave it at that. We'll link to a couple of recent articles, one of which I wrote on, whether you should go to college at all. Is college over? And it, offers up some ways to think about it and some cost-benefit analyses. But we've got three people here who have all, for good or bad, suffered through it. So Clifton, Bob, I want to thank you guys for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.